Welcome everyone. We're going to review the Lyra cards now. In the interest of trying to review cards before I play with them as much as possible, because Lyra is one of my favorite factions and I'm pretty likely to build with it early. Starting off here, we have winter clothes, or winter outfits, which came up in the Muna video, but this is a common version. The common version is only worse in that it doesn't lose fleeting every single time you play it. It doesn't have this Mulan clause that the rare has. And in Lyra, you're always going to want the common version, I believe. We're going to say that this one is a D, because it's going to be difficult to have base statistic 0 2 out of 7 times in the game, and even if there is that third time, you're going to be about breaking even if you spent a rare point to get to use the winter outfits a third time. So the common is going to be plenty. You're either going to be Fen and have so many cards getting in resupply that you don't need the additional card quantity provided by rare, or you're going to be a Nevenka and you're going to really need those rare points to buy cards that help you with card quantity issues in a more reliable way than the rare winter clothes help with card quantity issues. So I think either way you're going to end up on the common. I don't think you're going to be Arok in general, because Arok, despite being one of the 2 heroes of the set, didn't actually get that much experience, didn't actually get that much support in this set that Fen can't use even better. This card is really, really good for the reasons mentioned in the Muna video. It actually may be a little less good for Lyra, just because Lyra leverages cards like Cernunnos a little better, and Lyra is more likely to have more things it could play on any one turn, so that the zeros get stranded less, I think. Because you're getting to use more cards the second time when you play Fen. But this is still an A. This is a really good card. I still think that 1 cost after you with potential for on the board stats that day or the next day is just fundamentally very, very powerful. And this is going to make a lot of cards that were borderline playable, which like expands the card pool for Lyra. And this is really going to help with leveraging Aloe Vera, which that is something that I think Lyra does better than Muna, is play Aloe Vera early and often and support it with removal, support it with I guess it doesn't support it with Anchor as well, but support it in various ways. I think Aloe Vera in some ways performs better in Lyra than it does in Muna. And winter outfits plus Aloe Vera is a sort of win condition. The only weakness that the Aloe Vera has gets taken away and it can start performing really well. This is Winter Nova. You choose 3 bonuses and you can pick the same bonus multiple times. And these are just some various things you might want to do. So 2 of them are worth like roughly a 4/4/4. And if you kind of, napkin math that valuation, maybe this 8 mana spell puts a 4/4/4 in one expedition and 2 4/4/4s in the other expedition. Usually that is going to result in a 1/1 trade if your opponent also has 8 mana to spend, and you're behind in that 1/1 trade in the sense that you spent a rare point, and that in the sense that you put this card in your deck that was very risky to have in your deck. So this card is not going to be good. There's going to be other ways to make sure your deck has at least one way to target a permanent, and it's going to be rare enough that your opponent has 3/6/6/6 characters somehow, and the sacrifice mode is outperforming that estimate. So this is a D. Will-o'-the-Wisp. If the expedition facing me is in water, it can move forward only due to water. And the rare has slightly higher stats, slightly higher reserve cost, and it has the mana discount supportability. I think both versions of this card are very good. I don't remember exactly what I said in the Muna video, but I think this card has the promise of finding some ways to set up 2-0 advancements. We mentioned Aloe Vera being very powerful in Lyra in general, so just having Aloe Vera on your own side as part of what you're doing means that you don't have to rely on your opponent being actively bad at water to leverage this into creating biome statistics advantages that you could eventually push all the way to a 2-0 win. And this has a somewhat similar risk to a character with only 1/0 in terms of not finding anywhere that you can just play it down. I did the math on this the other day, but I forgot some of it. But it's slightly more risky than a single 0, but not as risky as most double zeros, if I remember my own napkin math on that correctly. And we also have this cost 1 less ability to help us buy it out if we are having trouble finding a place to play it 2 times. And we also have Winter Clothes in our deck, which is going to help a lot. That can help you if you are on the wrong biomes. Between the common and the rare, they're both pretty good. I would say that if you're getting one stat from the different place you put the rare point, probably the common is going to cut it. It's also nice to have this at common so that, well, I have to remember the Fen mindset. I don't actually play Lyra that much, and I've played a lot of Nevenka. You cannot mana zone this just because you don't like it in Fen, so I shouldn't necessarily say that. In Nevenka, it is nice to have it as a common so that you can mana zone it if you would like to. In Fen, you're playing it either way, so maybe the rare is the one you want. So let's just give both of them an A. I find both of them pretty exciting. And a good comparison for the rares, you can look at how similar Cernunnos is. And on day 1, this is even more similar to Cernunnos. And in Fen in particular, it's either you're likely to either see this on day 1 or see this so late in the game that you have like really good card quantity so that you can play whatever card you want, which is kind of like a win-win situation. You would only be in a tough spot if you drew this like exactly as your day 2 or day 3 draw. And otherwise, it's either utilizing the starting biomes to turn itself on, or it doesn't matter that it's not utilizing the center biomes to turn itself on because you're late enough in the game that you have really good card quantity. The Snowman. Unless I'm in water, I gain Fleeting. That's the common. The rare gets 2 forest stats and gets an exhausted resupply supportability. Both of these things are not enough. Only the most powerful cards are convincing when they get biome stats split across 2 of their stats. But I think getting 2 biome stats into your worst stat is significantly worse than that. So let's say this one is a D. What we're excited about is the common. And the supportability is just a break even. The common is an 033, which was not previously available in Lyra, and it has a downside. It will gain Fleeting some of the time. In Fen, you mitigate the downside by having good card quantity in general. So if you are playing this in a mono mountain space, which might not come up that often anyway, then you can just use your at noon resupply that's on Fenn's hero text and catch back up on cards anyway that way. I think Nevenka probably still plays this because the main Force Zero was Ouroboros Croupier before, and I think we got some better options to replace Ouroboros Croupier in this set. So I'll be able to move over to this. I guess you might want to do Esmeralda instead. Esmeralda can be a nice card sometimes, so maybe Nevenka skips this, but Fenn alone is going to give this an A. I've seen some Fenn players spend rare points on Bravos Pathfinder, the one climbing a mountain, and I don't disagree with that right away. It's actually really nice to have 2-cost characters with really strong stats that are suited for every biome. So it's definitely going to be nice to take a very minor downside and get this at common. So this is a big boost to Fenn. This helps Iraq a lot. This is going to be really nice for Iraq. It's not quite enough, but it is going to be very helpful. So this is going to be an A. The Magic Sleigh. If my expedition would move forward during dusk, it moves twice instead. And the rare has fleeting, and it's cheaper. Between the two of these, I believe you want to play the rare, because if you pull this off, and pulling this off means that you somehow didn't lose an expedition you wouldn't have lost anyway when you play this out. Anytime you pull it off, I think you only need to pull it off once to be in a really good position to win the game. And I think it's really questionable whether you can pull it off at all. So that makes me want to just take the cheapest version and just try my darndest to get it to work. I don't think you want to put it in as a 4-cost in Nevenka on the logic that you can mana zone it when you are worried you can't pull it off, because I think you're going to have to restructure a lot of your deck to be focused on pulling this off anyway, so you're going to be hosed either way if you can't make this happen. I am overall pretty skeptical that it's going to be possible to make this happen frequently. When you throw this down, your opponent can marshal their resources to make sure that you're not going to be able to keep up on the expeditions while making this trigger. And if you trigger this after a delay, you've probably fallen too far behind on expeditions. It's worth noting that Ortis Carrier is kind of a similar card that isn't good enough as a common. It's not good enough to try to play the Ortis Carrier on day 3 and try to win one expedition using only 3 mana. And then even though the Ortis Carrier creates so much advantage, on top of the Ortis Carrier being a decent day 1 play if you have a bad hand, it's just not enough. So we're just going to give this a D after some discussion about what it would take for it to be good, because I don't think it's going to be good enough. As the card pool expands, this is definitely one to keep an eye on, because specific cards could give you more ability to just pick a specific day and say, hey, I'm going to 1-1 on this specific day because I have these cards that are really good at creating a 1-1. Something like an even more pushed version of Hooked, for example, would be really good at that. And if you can align that with the Magic Sleigh and get this 3-cost small step, then that could really be your plan for how you get ahead of other decks. Snowball Commando. You may exhaust a card in reserve, and then there's a 50% chance that player gets to exhaust a card in your reserve. And your opponent gets to base which card they exhaust based on which card you exhausted. This is a pretty interesting one. I think that 2 in water is just really rough. I think it can be really tricky to find a place to play an 032. And you're willing to do that when 033s aren't available, but we just got an 033. And I think the ceiling here is definitely going to find lots of spots where this feels better than an 033. But the 2 cost point frequently has to be workhorses. You have to have cards that just get the job done and don't put you in a vulnerable position, because your spicier cards are often at the 3 and 4 cost, where the design space is more explored. And this isn't like such an impressive effect that you want to reverse that mindset. Exhausting an opponent's card might not be game winning that consistently. So I'm going to give this a C. It's not embarrassing. This has a 2 in forest. Similar comments to the snowman. Improving your worst stat by 2 is not really... It's not as good as a use of a rare point as improving 2 stats by 1, I don't think. If you like this card, you'll probably like the common Snowball Commando even better, and you can support the Snowball Commando with something like a Cernunnos that has a more helpful improvement to the overall statistics of your deck. So D. Sleight of Hand. Exchange target character in your reserve with a card from your hand. And this one removes the character restriction, so it can just be any card. I like the common better here. There's not that many is it the card in your hand that becomes able to be a spell? The card in reserve is the one that gets freed up on the typing. Yeah, so there's not that many spells that have a higher reserve cost than hand cost. And when you're playing Fen, you kind of have to include less of those anyway, because you can't just like start the game with a sleight of hand in your hand. So I think we're not going to like to spend a rare point on this edge case here. We're going to give the sleight of hand rare a D. And keep in mind, you can just like add Flamel to your deck for a rare point if you really want to bounce spells. I think that's going to be better for Nevenka, who is happy to spend a rare point for an effect that gives her a half card. The common is pretty good. I think you won't play like a super high count of this, because the Winter Close is actual stats, and Sleight of Hand needs some kind of specific thing to be going on for it to convert into stats super easily. But a 1 cost after you does not take very much to be good. And there's probably going to be a lot of versatile lines that evolve from this card. I'll give this one a B. I think it probably gets used in Fen. But the cooldown ability is a little bit significant on the early turns of the game. It might make this feel less exciting than the acapella lines that have a lot of immediate after you when it's clear that strong after you is going to be very powerful. And it similarly might feel a little bit weaker than if you play Winter Close, immediately advance that expedition, and then play Winter Close again. Again, in a situation where the texture of your hand tells you that after you is going to be very useful. And so that balances up against the super cool best cases that this card has, such as returning a Tanuki from your reserve to your hand. That's obviously the main story that this card is trying to tell. Silent Night. Target a character, then roll a die. On a 4+, it gains Anchored. On a 1-3, it gains Asleep. This is a pretty interesting card. If you play it early, you get to like play the rest of the turn knowing what this did to your turn, which is pretty interesting if you like start a turn with an aloe vera and you're kind of like not sure if your opponent's knowledge of where you have that 4 water committed off the get-go is like going to let your opponent get a 1/1. So if you put the aloe vera to sleep, it's sort of like you're like shipping that advantage down the road to next turn when you're going to be going second. And it's going to make it even easier to leverage that aloe vera into a 2-0. So that kind of thing is pretty interesting. But relating that anecdote kind of makes me think about how narrow and specific those things I just described are. And playing this late in the turn, it seems like it's a lot of the time going to be similar to a beauty sleep, where your thing might fall asleep and you might lose your stats, and maybe that's a problem. I guess I do like the first play of beauty sleep a lot, so when I put it that way, it is a pretty interesting card. I guess another comparison we could make here is that this is almost a snooze. It costs 1 more than a snooze, but we're not getting the front half of the card. This triggers the Khadgar Mage Dancer for only 1 mana. I imagine that is part of the fun here. I'm gonna give this a C. A major issue with adding this to Nevenka is that this is like half a card on a card. And you're already pressured to put some half a card cards in your deck that deal with what your opponent is doing when you add removal to your deck. So you don't have a lot of room to add a lot of these before you start running out of cards as Nevenka. So this might actually show up more in Fen, but I think it's kind of borderline and not quite good enough in Fen. It might just be better to play Twinkle Twinkle and have that second play and just pay a little more mana when you recognize that sleeping your own stuff is good. Here is the same as the Ortis Silent Night we saw, where you roll a die and then target a character. I think the analysis that I did in the Ortis video is going to be pretty similar here. If you get the sleep option, it's potentially possible that nothing on the board feels good to sleep. And the card Sandman has a much easier time with that because you're getting an 0/3/3 for 3 mana. So the immediate board impact makes it more likely that there's something on the board that you can sleep that feels good. But when nothing on the board is changing when you expend 2 mana, it's much more likely that the stats on the board are some distribution where you can't find a place for the sleep mode. So I'm going to give this one a D. Santa Claus. Starting with you, each player may immediately play a card with hand cost 3 or less for free. And there's a 4 mana version. I can't think of a card that costs more from reserve than from hand that Lyra can leverage with this. I can't think of many ways that Santa Claus is breaking the symmetry of this in general. Part of the idea here is that Arak gets a 0 trigger here. I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with the ability, but they haven't released a cool 5-cost card with a 0 yet, so that's nice for Arak. I think Arak still doesn't play this, though. I think Fen, Nevenka, and Arak all don't play this. The only thing I came up with for this when it was in Muna is the idea of exhausting your opponent's hand and then playing Festival. But in Lyra, I don't think you should be playing Festival. Small Step is so good in Lyra, and they really compete for the same resources and deck building considerations. So I'm going to give both Santas a D. I guess it does kind of go with the Rock's ability that you're going to get multiple applause triggers if you play another card with a 0 when you play the Santa Claus. But I think that's kind of a marginal thing overall. The common might barely be playable for a Rock, but it's not going to be like a huge boost to her power level. Rallying Call. Target character gains 1 boost. If it is asleep, it gains anchored and loses asleep. This is nifty on Kodama, which is a little bit different from a war bureaucrat in that it's falling asleep in a compulsory manner. But overall, you're not going to have enough friendly targets for this consistently, so this is just going to be a D. They just had to pick a faction for this, but really only Warrior's design makes sense for this to be an entire card. Persephone. My region and the region of the expedition facing me are forest and lose their other types. So this is pretty similar to the Will-o'-the-Wisp rare version, but we're a little bit smaller. We're not at 4 water. And we're also not aligned to the stat profile of Aloe Vera, which I was really excited about. And I don't think there's a similar force polarized card in Lyra that I'm excited about in the same way. So I'm going to give Persephone a C. I think it hurts her a lot that your deck might have a Will-o'-the-Wisp in it, and the fact that your deck has a Will-o'-the-Wisp in it might make you just not want to add Persephone and then add characters that are good at forest, unless it becomes 3/0/3/4/0/4 but there's cost to doing that too. So I think if you pick one of the 3 biomes to be the one that you have cool transformation effects around, it's probably better than picking 2 of them, and that's probably going to be a fight that Will-o'-the-Wisp will win, which might be a pretty interesting design to play out in this set, since Rin is going to be doing the forest version. Pamola. It's an 0/3/2, and as a support ability, you can exhaust target card in reserve. This is close to strictly worse than the Snowball Commando. So I'm going to say please play the Snowball Commando. I guess you can exhaust a card in reserve for 0 mana, which is sometimes powerful. And in Fen, sometimes you'll resupply this directly. But this is an entire rare slot. You're going to need Tinkerbells for a rare slot. You're going to need other interaction for a rare slot, so don't go for this. Ortis Night Warden. If I would gain a sleep, I gain anchored instead. This is another card where there's just not the critical mass of sleep to make this make sense. You could add 3 common Sandmans, 3 Twinkle Twinkles, and then 3 rare Kodamas. I still think you just don't quite get there, because this is a 3-cost 2/2 if you don't draw any of them. So we're going to say a D. This might be fun with future design, though. We'll see. Nyala Gifted Conjurer. Exchange target card from your reserve with a card from your hand. This is an interesting one to be in the same set as the Sleight of Hand, because this one has some stats. It's not an empty air card, but it doesn't pass quite as well. It also doesn't have as much of the wow factor of your opponent not expecting a play at all that you enabled with the Sleight of Hand. Like if you were able to put a Tinkerbell into your reserve, even though they know your deck mostly relies on from reserve sabotage effects, and it's like, oh, actually I could lose my reserve. That kind of stuff, you have to spend more mana to do the flip, so it's less spicy. That doesn't really affect the power level that much because you're keeping up on the expedition for what you pay. I think this stat profile is kind of at a premium because it's nice if you can figure out a way your deck can be a Hatter deck. Hatter is a pretty interesting card. I think it's not always the right call to play Hatter, but sometimes it is. And then Tanuki is also powerful and exciting. Oh, and then Hathor, that's the main one. Hathor is very impressive at 3/3/0. So this stat profile is very flooded in Lyra with really exciting cards. And Hathor especially is very similar to what this card is doing and better at it. Just because you have a better stat character for fighting on turns that you want to go for a 2/0 with the 2-cost 3/3/0. And they'll perform similarly on the turns you're just trying to improve your hand with reserve manipulation. So I'm going to give this a D. Just doing some strong stances here and there, even though this card isn't terrible. This one has Exhausted Resupply. I didn't remember to think about this one in advance. I'm going to say this is a B. I'm pretty excited about this in Vanka. You have to cut either Tanuki or Hatter for it, but Hatter is really difficult to use in Navanka. I think even more difficult than it is to use in Fen. And playing Tanuki to interact with your opponent's reserve is sort of a luxury Navanka doesn't have sometimes, I think, because of her struggles with keeping her deck cohesive and keeping her hand full. So I think I like the idea of this way of drawing cards. It's a better mana to stat ratio than Ouroboros Croupier. And it has a lot of flexibility. I also like that this lets you pick up and off you go, because I like playing off you go with spell bounce uniques in Navanka. I don't know if that's the best build, but it's a pretty fun build, and I don't definitely know that it's not the best build. It might be the best build. So since I'm a big fan of that deck, I like the idea of card exchange in Navanka. And because this is card quantity, which is something I think is really important for Navanka, it suddenly becomes on game plan. So we're going to go with B here. Nisei. Roll a die on a 4+ resupply, on a 1/3 exhausted resupply. Sorry about that sound. This card doesn't get you the card draw that you get to have on Ouroboros Croupier some of the time, but it's a much better cost to stat ratio. And I think this is going to be better than Lyra Navigator almost all the time. And I usually play like 1 or 2 Lyra Navigator. I think because the exhausted resupply is not a super reliable way to have enough cards in hand to play the game, that this isn't going to be like the main card you lean on to fix card draw issues in Navanka. And I don't think you play this in Fen at all, because this is a hand ability, so if you resupply this, it's pretty mediocre in Fen. I don't know if I misspoke there, but I was talking about Fen. So I'm going to give this let's say a B. I think you play 1 or 2 in Navanka, so that's at least a B. I think it's going to be pretty rare that anyone is going to punish you for this not having the 4th Forest and 4th Water that appears on the Lyra Chronicler. But it will be interesting to see how that pans out. If Lyra Chronicler becomes better because we're playing it alongside Will-o'-the-Wisp, I think that'll be pretty fun and exciting. The rare costs 2 from reserve. I think this is here to make it more attractive to Fen and Crowbar. I think you don't need this cost reduction. You might not find a place to play it. You might only be able to play this 0 polarization one time. It's not terrible. Let's say C. Magpang Hoarder. If you have 2 or more cards in reserve, I gain 1 boost and fleeting. If you have 2 or more cards in reserve, I gain 2 boosts and fleeting. Interestingly, if you have exactly 2 cards in reserve, and you play this from reserve, it's like exactly a Nancy. And a Nancy's pretty good. The common is also good. 2 costs for a 3/3/3. Or 2 costs for a 4/4/4. Since you're only playing this once, I think this kind of looks like it's going to be something you play common, because usually Cernanos is offering you to get extra stats twice for your rare point, and this is offering extra stats once. And as you design your deck, and sometimes that will be something that becomes interchangeable or movable in the way you design your deck. So I'm going to guess that we play the common. So let's say that this is C, because it's definitely not obvious that we're not doing the rare. I'm going to say that the common is an A, because as far as I can tell, this card is just going to let you, as Fen, play a Bravos Tracer in a deck that has very little card quantity issues, when card quantity is supposed to be the downside of a Bravos Tracer. And that's just pretty awesome. I don't think Nevenka is going to be playing with this. Maybe she will. Nevenka might be solving her own card quantity problems enough to want to do this. It is a pretty exciting amount of stats, but Fen definitely. This is a pretty big boost. So, I don't remember if I said A, but I'm saying A. Magic Beans. Target character in my expedition gains 1 boost. My region and the region of the expedition facing me is now forest. There's not many Lyra characters with a forest stat higher than their mana cost. There's Hatter, there's Lyra Navigator, which we recently maybe perhaps decided to stop using for other cards. So this is probably just not going to fit the Lyra card pool that much. So let's say D. On top of comments that were made in the Muda video about why I'm not sure an understated angle into this effect is worthwhile. Lost in the Woods. Send target character to reserve. If it wasn't in forest, its controller draws a card. And discard target permanent. I think you'll need to target something that is actually in forest most of the time, because I don't think Fen is especially good at making your opponent's card quantity not matter, even though she has her own card quantity. And neither do any of the other 2 heroes. This is not as good at removing permanents as Cloth Cocoon, and not as good at removing characters as Off You Go. The main thing that this would do that those 2 don't do is remove large large characters without any of the enabled abilities from Cloth Cocoon. But if you ever run into that, I would recommend trying to sleep it and trying to win before it wakes up. You can even sleep it twice because Twinkle Twinkle doesn't have fleeting. And if you are in the rare case where you're not close enough to ending the game to do that, it's kind of just a bad beat. It's kind of just not something that happens that much of the time. You can also use acapella training plus Cloth Cocoon or Twinkle Twinkle plus Cloth Cocoon if you need to. And those don't cost any rare points. Those cost more mana, but not any rare points. So I'm going to give this a D. Joyride. Discard another card from your reserve. If you do, target character gains 2 boosts. So this is a little bit like a rare Ordish Trooper, but we can't put it wherever we want. We need at least one character in that expedition, which is not free. Lyra only has 1 common 1-drop, and this set adds no new common 1-drops to Lyra. So Lyra can sometimes not have a presence in an expedition that it wants to establish a presence in. I think we also didn't get any characters with a 2 to 3 hand cost from hand and 1 cost from reserve either. But this is more stats than the mana you're spending. At the same time, you're losing a card from reserve. And the idea is that Fen gets extra cards from reserve for free. So she's more able to do that. But I think this is going to be too close to a break even because I think Fen is going to have designed her deck to expect those cards to be in reserve. For example, her hand might be full of Anansi's that she needs to play on the next turn, and if the 1 cost part of her turn is that she's supposed to Joyride, and then on the next turn she's only going from 1 in reserve to 2 in reserve instead of going from 2 in reserve to 3 in reserve, then she's really breaking even. It ends up being like this Joyride was a 1/1/1 for 1, which is slightly below rate in some senses, and especially below rate when this is a spell that had a flexibility cost. A spell with cooldown, no less. It does fill your reserve immediately, but it just took a card out of your reserve. It's kind of funny to think about. But that does mean, for instance, if you remove acapella training from your deck to add this in, the acapella training might be almost as good at boosting as the Joyride if you have an Anansi, and it might be almost as good as the Joyride at executing some kind of game plan if acapella training is the reason you're able to play Cernunnos instead of playing Tanuki, because Cernunnos is bigger. So those kinds of things. So I'm going to give this a D. I'm not sold. This is one where I'm probably going to have egg on my face if I'm wrong, because it's a small amount of mana for an overstated amount of stats. And Ordish Trooper was one I was really wrong on from the first set. This one just loses cooldown. This is like a D with an exclamation mark that we want to play the common. I think losing cooldown is just like not enough for a rare point. I mean, you might even have, if you have 2 of these, and cooldown isn't really a downside, is it? You could just play one, play the other one, and the next turn play one, play the other one. Removing cooldown will be good sometimes. It's just not going to be good all the times, and you're looking for the greatest percentage of the time that a rare point spend helped you when you expended it. Icebound Tundra. When you play a character in a region type where its base statistic is 0, I gain a trial counter. Icebounds are not very good because there's only specific parts of the game when you can play them, because you can't play them on turn 1 because they'll cost you an advancement, and you can't play them at the very end of the game because you won't get your dragon. So anything that keeps you from playing them at the middle of the game is a death knell, and this says that you need a region type where your base statistic is 0, and that is not guaranteed. So this is in D. We are not into this. Same thing. Not into this. Icebound Taiga. When you play a character in Forest, I gain a trial counter. Same thing. The biomes need to be a specific thing for us to play it. D. Hypothermia. Each player chooses a character they control. It gains a sleep. I didn't realize until looking at the Lyra cards that this card combos with a Night Warden, where you don't lose statistics at all if you pick the Night Warden. The Night Warden just gets a bonus instead of falling asleep. I think we're not allowed to put enough Night Wardens in our deck due to the name rule for that to really flip the script on whether Hypothermia is worth it. I think this probably isn't worth it. Especially since you choose first. It's still an issue that you choose first. And it's worse here than in Ortis because Fen is the one with the card quantity to be playing cards that don't reliably have stats. But Fen gets annoyed when this has a low hand cost and a high reserve cost. She likes being able to get cards out of her reserve and not overflow if she prefers to. Sometimes she doesn't prefer to because she wants Swanancy. But I think she likes to at least have the option. So this is a D. Heimdall. You may have target character switch expeditions. Thinking about it for a little bit, and then I'm going to say D. This is just only ever going to get a 1/1 trade. And even though it's a common, so unlike we saw this in Ortis as rare, even though it's not like costing you that much, it's not even costing you like very much risk of like losing to a 2-0 if it gets removed, because you can just play it on day 2 when it's probably not affordable to remove it and also play a character. It's just not offering you anything. It's just not offering you any upside. If you're like in top deck mode and you're looking for a cool card that's gonna like win you tiebreakers or something, this just isn't doing anything cool. It would help keep you ahead if you're ahead in the game, but Lyra actually doesn't usually get ahead and stay ahead. Lyra actually is a small step, giant leap deck a lot of the time. So that might not be where you're at. Next page. The rare has a little bit better stats, and it has this funny expedition permanent text. I think there's just no expedition permanents in the card pool that make me care about this enough, but I can easily imagine expedition permanents released in the future where this becomes sort of like give an expedition permanent fleeting, where you send it to the expedition where it's going to win unexpectedly, and your opponent didn't want it to win unexpectedly, and it dies early. I guess it's a little more like send to reserve than like give fleeting. So with future cards, I think this could be pretty interesting. But with the current cards, this is just slightly better stats, but you spent a rare point, and you just got what you paid for on the stats. So we don't like the base card enough, so we're not going to do this. The slightly better stats seems to be pointing at pairing this with Persephone and Will-o'-the-Wisp to move characters over to a side where they get blown out by those special effects. But I think this is kind of dampened by Ortis being really, really popular and having really even stats. And Aphanis also has some even stats from throwing boosts around, so that's not doing it for me. Haven say Rengar. When I leave the expedition zone, if I was fleeting, draw a card. And the second time you play it, gets a boost. This is very low stats. So this is Lyra Navigator stats. And we paid a rare to have Lyra Navigator stats. You have to play this on top of a Persephone or a Winter's Close to not be falling apart. If I vastly underrate the availability of Persephone and Winter's Close and a deck designed around it, maybe this could be a thing to do, but I think you don't want to. I think you don't want to do this. I think you'll have too many catastrophes from that not coming together, and this being your rare point spend in addition to being your 2-drops. So this is going to be a D. Garrick, Revered Duelist. If I would gain Fleeting, I gain 1 boost instead. This is very funny with acapella training, where you can just give a boost for 1 mana. And this also gets a boost the second time you play it, just naturally because of the rules of the game. It does give Nevenka a way to never run out of cards, which is nice, but if you have to be mediocre to never run out of cards, it ends up not being worth it because you only have to lose 1 expedition from your mediocrity before you're pushing yourself out of the game. We already had Wukong and Mulan offering that kind of play pattern, and we got to try them out in set 1. And it turned out that that wasn't an exchange you wanted to do. You want to somehow find a way to have enough cards in hand and keep on putting out stats that are almost as impressive as other decks. And a 4-cost 4/4/4 is not almost as impressive as other decks. I'm going to give this a D. Fin and Crowbar. Eat me energy bars. If there's only 1 character in my expedition, it is Gigantic. And you can only play it 1 time. This card is very tricky to evaluate. It's very new. It has the potential to give you way more stats than you deserve because it's costs 2 mana, but the character you're duplicating could be worth 3 mana, it could be worth 4 mana. It probably can't be worth 5 or 6 mana because we haven't figured out how to play 5 and 6 mana characters in decks much in Altered. So the ceiling is that you can really get ahead on mana, and getting ahead on mana to this extent could mean that you are able to get 2-0s. I think if you float this in play and go to the next day, your opponent is able to play around what it does by focusing on beating the expedition with the Eat Me energy bars in it, because you can only play 1 character there. So they know you're going to be easy enough to beat there, so if they want to 1-1 you, that's the place to target. Which means this would be the most powerful if you can play it as the last card of the turn. And you would want to be losing in the other side and then throw your stats over onto that side at the last second by playing the Eat Me energy bars onto something maybe like an aloe vera that's soloing 1 side. Overall, I think that seems kind of narrow, but it is a neat win condition. It's a neat way to have a plan for how you're going to have big turns that get you 2-0 advancements, because you need at least 1 2-0 advancement or a small step or a strong tiebreaker performance to win any game of Altered, right? So I'll give this a C. I think the other the other exciting things in the set are more promising, like Aloe Vera Winter Clothes, for example. Break the Ice. Same as the Ortis one, but now we're at common. And the discount is from having 3 or more base statistics of 0 among characters you control. So that's going to be 3 characters with 1 0, or just 1 rare Nazi or Ouroboros Trickster. The rare has cooldown and doesn't have fleeting. I think we're not playing the rare because the common is very difficult to pull off. You need 3 or more base statistics of 0. So that's 3 different characters unless you have a double 0. And there's not that many double 0s that you can really play. And Ouroboros Trickster doesn't make the cut a lot of the time. This is removal. Removal is nice. Arak is definitely more willing to play this than anyone else because even though she still is limited to the same number of Ouroboros Tricksters per deck, I think she's incentivized to play almost no characters with no zeros and structure her turns where she's spamming them a lot. So she's going to be able to play this a little more often. Although she doesn't like flipping this off the top, so that's an issue too. I'm gonna give this a D. I think this isn't powerful enough when you do it to deal with the inflexibility. And in some regards, both Nevenka and Fen are looking for flexibility. Nevenka is looking for flexibility in the sense that she doesn't have enough card quantity to not play some of the cards she draws. And Fen cannot put some of the cards she draws into mana. So it's similar issues going both ways. So I think this isn't going to find a spot. If it does find a spot, it'll likely be because removal is just that important. It's just your opponents are up to really dastardly things and you need to send them to reserve. Bravo's Trailblazer. I gain 1 boost for each fleeting character you control. I think this card could get a lot better when we get more 1-cost characters in Lyra that don't cost a rare point. Because it's hard to have lots of fleeting characters if you don't have lots of characters. This is overstated when you have even 1 fleeting character. This is a pretty reasonable minigame to play. Yeah, it's great that there's low risk when you aren't really going for the minigame and decent payoff when you are going for the minigame. But I think we just don't have the character suite for it quite yet. It doesn't help that like Esmeralda is a from hand ability, which would be like one of the first ones I'm thinking of that I might play along with this. It has a little combo with Snowman, so that's neat, but I'm gonna say this is a D, but this is one that I really like as soon as we get more sets. Avalanche. Send to reserve any number of target characters with total mountain of 4 or less. I think it is pretty easy to find a spot where you're pulling ahead with this. You just have to find any mountain of 0 and you get to just like remove an average character and a bonus character for 3. And that could pivot you into a 2-0 using a fleeting rare. Getting a 2-0 with a fleeting rare is a good deal. And then the floor on this is that you just have to like trade even mana on something like a Sir Nunos, and you go down half a card because this is fleeting and something like Sir Nunos is not fleeting. But Fen has the card quantity to just do that all day long. That might mean that Nevenka might not want this. It could be that Nevenka does not have better ways to get 2 O's than doing the same thing, and Nevenka will just play even more card draw so that she gets to do this too. So either way, this is an A at least in Fen, I think, although it won't be a super high card count, I don't think. And a rock probably plays like one of these. I guess a rock might not want to flip it off the top, so maybe a rock is she can be the one to skip this. But this is a pretty neat card. It is much easier to just cycle this away because Nevenka and Fen have inflexibility than it is the Break the Ice, which costs more. And a rock. That's the last card. And we're coming in at about an hour, so I'm doing my best to get quicker and quicker with these. Thank you for watching. If you like watching these videos, you can press the subscribe button to find out when I release a new one, because they come out at different times. These two are going to be spaced pretty close together. Some of the other ones are spaced out a little more, and the algorithm doesn't always find them. And leave a comment if you have anything to say. But other than that, I hope you watch 1 or 2 more of these videos, and I hope I can get them all out early in the life of the set. Thank you!